to WorldAware's live briefing on the anti-government protests in Lebanon. My name is Mary Chapman. I'm Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware, and I'll be moderating today's briefing. This week's live briefing on Lebanon is being presented by Shannon Armstrong and Tony Rocafort. Shannon is an intelligence analyst for the Middle East and North Africa team at WorldAware. She graduated from Tulane University with degrees in international relations and Middle East studies. Shannon is going to provide some background on the anti-government sentiment in Lebanon and how she sees the situation developing over the next few weeks. Shannon?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for listening in. This presentation will focus on the ongoing nationwide anti-government demonstrations that began in Lebanon on October 17th. I will first outline what prompted the protests, how they developed throughout the country, why the protests are notable, and what the government response has been. I will then transition into the country's outlook and what we may expect moving forward. Mass demonstrations broke out nationwide the evening of October 17th in response to an announcement by Information Minister Jamal Al-Jarrah that the cabinet had approved taxes on the use of WhatsApp calling and other internet calling platforms such as Facebook Messenger and FaceTime. Thousands of protesters gathered on Riyadh al-Sol Road in central Beirut, as well as in Tripoli, Tyre, Baalbek, and towns throughout the Bekaa Valley. To provide some context, it's worth noting that social discontent has long been an issue throughout Lebanon with regards to the country's deteriorating economic situation and poor public services. Lebanon has one of the world's highest public debts, and back in September, the then Prime Minister Saad Hariri announced an agreement among Lebanese politicians to declare a state of economic emergency and accelerate public finance reforms. Yet, despite a series of austerity measures passed by Parliament in recent months to address the crisis, both the foreign and local credit ratings remain negative. Deposits into Lebanon's banking sector have continued to decrease, thus resulting in dwindling currency reserves. The lack of hard currency has resulted in a growing dollar crisis that has produced a myriad of negative effects, such as companies being forced to buy dollars above the fixed exchange rate. Many businesses, most notably the gas station owners, maintain that the country's shortages in dollar reserves has made it difficult to pay their suppliers. As a result, these fuel distributors have organized a series of recent strikes in efforts to receive government concessions. In addition to these strikes, there have been numerous protests in recent months to condemn alleged government corruption and to demand remedies for economic grievances. These demonstrations have been organized by various political parties and civil society groups. The government faces considerable pressure to reverse the country's difficult economic conditions, and the WhatsApp tax was among several government proposals to increase revenues ahead of a proposed 2020 budget. Approving the 2020 budget, complete with fiscal reforms and austerity measures, is imperative to receiving pledged donor money and investment from abroad. The passage of the WhatsApp tax bill, however, prompted immediate backlash and outrage from the public, who often rely on free internet applications for communication due to the high cost of state-owned telecommunication services. The bill mobilized the public and served as the catalyst for nationwide protests condemning government inaction, corruption, and years of economic mismanagement. The protests have been leaderless, growing organically and spontaneously in response to widespread social discontent. Protesters have conducted a general strike across Lebanon for nearly 2 weeks now, bringing the country to a standstill by shutting down highways and roads, closing schools and banks, and stopping all normal business operations. The protests have been comprised predominantly of young people who are frustrated by the government's inability to make serious economic reforms. In response to the widespread demonstrations, the government revoked the proposed tax plan and proposed a series of reforms which included reducing the salaries of politicians by half. However, the protests show little sign of abating. Protesters are now demanding widespread political reforms, the resignation of the entire government, and new elections. The demonstrations pose a great threat to the political elite and are Lebanon's largest demonstrations since the Cedar Revolution in 2005, which were prompted by former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri's assassination. Since the onset of these protests, Lebanese authorities have endeavored to appease the protesters, quiet the unrest, and return the country to a state of normalcy. Prime Minister Saad Hariri addressed the nation in a speech on October 21st to announce this unprecedented reform package. However, the government's efforts did not quell the protests. Further strikes were launched in response to the reforms, and demonstrators have increasingly demanded the removal of Lebanon's entire ruling class. 4 ministers from the Lebanese Forces Party, which is one of Hariri's allies, resigned from the government on October 19th in response to the protests. President Michel Aoun has thus far refused protester demands that he resign, instead addressing the nation via a televised speech on October 24th, in which he called for dialogue with the demonstrators. Aoun stated that the government could not be changed from the streets, but rather must be done through constitutional reforms. He has attributed blame for the country's crisis on sectarianism and corruption, and has vowed to hold the politicians responsible. Aoun's speech, however, had a similar effect as Hariri's. It failed to quell the protests and instead has fueled additional calls for the government's resignation. Thus, the country's political leadership has fundamentally lost their legitimacy among the people. These demonstrations are notable in that they have transcended the country's deep sectarian divides. Unlike previous demonstrations that manifested along the lines of sectarian and political affiliations, the recent protests are unified across sects as the public stands in solidarity against the ruling elite. On October 27th, for example, tens of thousands of Lebanese joined hands to form a 105-mile-long human chain running north to south across the country and passing straight through Beirut. This demonstration was an unprecedented display of cross-sectarian public mobilization and unity. On October 29th, Prime Minister Saad Hariri delivered a victory to these anti-government protesters when he conceded to protester demands and announced his resignation. While the immediate impact of Hariri's resignation on the Lebanese political system remains to be seen, this move is likely to further complicate the political crisis in the country. In the days following Hariri's resignation, the military succeeded in reopening key roads across the country. And in addition, banks and schools have announced that they will resume normal operations. However, despite these developments, protests and social unrest are likely to continue nationwide. Hariri's resignation was a key demand of the protesters, but the public is still adamant about a complete overhaul of the political system. Protesters attribute the country's alleged prevalent corruption to the sectarian government, which they claim has only benefited the political elites. A key slogan of the protests has been, "All of them means all of them," referring to the demands that all political elites step down from office. Protesters continue to demand the election of a new, transparent, and non-sectarian government. The Lebanese political system currently operates under a confessional system, requiring that political power is distributed according to sect. This political arrangement has been in place for decades and helped to restore peace following Lebanon's civil war. Political elites in Lebanon believe that this system of power sharing has ensured social and political stability. Hariri's resignation raises questions about the immediate future of Lebanese politics and what comes next. President Michel Aoun officially accepted Hariri's resignation on October 30th and has instructed Hariri and his cabinet to stay on in a caretaker capacity. The caretaker administration will oversee daily operations pending new elections and the formation of a new government. The president will now consult with the country's various political parties to designate a new prime minister. However, it's not immediately apparent who will replace Hariri, as the position must be reserved for a Sunni politician per Lebanon's government structure. The process of forming a new government is also likely to be a lengthy one. It took 9 months for Hariri to form his coalition cabinet after taking office this past January. A new candidate would need to hold discussions with the various political parties and negotiate the allocation of ministries. Thus, in the coming months, it's unlikely that significant political change will be observed. Hariri's resignation has also created a political vacuum in Lebanon, which is one of the reasons that Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Shia militant group Hezbollah, has opposed the government's resignation. Hezbollah is a major player in Lebanese politics. A political deal between the Future Movement and Hezbollah, the Free Patriotic Movement Alliance, brought President Aoun to power in 2016, and Hezbollah stands to lose greatly from a change in the status quo. New elections would likely translate into significant loss of power for Hezbollah, which is partly why the militant group has encouraged counter-protests across the country. Numerous clashes have been reported between anti-government protesters and pro-Hezbollah counter-protesters since the demonstrations began. Nevertheless, the country's political and economic crisis requires an immediate solution. Protesters have thus far advocated for a non-political administration of technocrats to help guide the country through a series of reforms and stave off economic collapse. In that instance, Hariri may be asked to stay on as prime minister to guide a cabinet of technocrats through emergency measures. However, any new government will struggle to reverse poor economic conditions and promote social stability while not upsetting the delicate power balance between the country's various religious sects. Lebanon will likely enter a period of uncharted instability as the country's leadership struggles to address the protesters' demands amid an uncertain political climate.
Thank you, Shannon. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Rockefort. Tony works as a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response team. Prior to joining Global Assistance and Response, he was a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict. Tony is going to discuss preparedness tips for organizations and their employees operating in the region. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Shannon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. Given the current situation on the ground, clients should carefully consider their need to travel to Lebanon before launching any new trips. For any travel in the pipeline, make sure all trips are being tracked properly. All contact information for personnel, their hotels, transportation providers, and local points of contact should be collected, validated, and logged for easy access. Additionally, ensure that all travelers are registering their trips with their diplomatic missions in Beirut. Make sure that all personnel traveling to Lebanon have received intelligence and safety briefings prior to any travel. This applies ahead of the return trip as well, so your people don't drive headfirst into a roadblock en route to the airport. Travelers should also submit a detailed itinerary well in advance of their trip, and security managers should be notified of any changes to that itinerary immediately. Travelers should also ensure that at least one trusted associate or family member is aware of their travel plans. Travelers should ensure that emergency contact information and medical information, i.e. their blood type, known allergies, required medications, insurance numbers, etc., are all recorded in their traveler profile, and that copies of passports, identification, and other important documents are up to date and stored in a safe location, preferably with a trusted colleague or a family member. The traveler's local points of contact in Lebanon, to include drivers, should be vetted and verified. All ground transportation should be coordinated well in advance. Photos and contact information of all local drivers, as well as their vehicle make and tag numbers, should also be communicated to employees well before any travel to the region. As likewise, all routes should be pre-planned as well. I'm sure many clients have already done so, but if you haven't, organizations should consider implementing a work from home or a work from hotel policy. Organizations considering a work from home policy should also ensure personnel are adequately equipped with multiple forms of communication, remote access capability, and backup power supplies. In Beirut, be careful to avoid the downtown area, particularly, as Shannon mentioned, along Riyadh Al Soh Road and elsewhere near the government palace. Also, and this probably goes without saying, with the exception of travel to and from the airport, clients should minimize unnecessary movement in Beirut's southern districts. Outside of Beirut, WorldAware is advising against unnecessary movement in Lebanon, particularly in northern Lebanon, particularly in the Tripoli, Hermel, Al-Qa, Ras al-Babat corridor, as well as other areas of the northern Bekaa Valley. Sectarian tensions in the north tend to run high anyway, but the ongoing demonstrations could exacerbate the friction in the region. Avoid the eastern border areas as well. As I just mentioned, give yourself a wide berth in the northern Bekaa Valley, but even in the central Bekaa Valley and further south, avoid movement within 10 to 15 kilometers of the Syrian border. As for the southern border, most of Lebanon's border with Israel is essentially a closed military zone already, so any travel to the immediate border area is already somewhat restricted. But out of an abundance of caution, consider minimizing movement south of Tyre. Expect the increased security posture in the region to continue for the foreseeable future, so plan movements accordingly. Allow extra time for overland travel, particularly to Rafik Hariri International south of Beirut. Verify, as always, onward transportation before initiating movement to the airport. Make sure your flight is still on time before checking out of your accommodations. If confronted by security forces, comply with all instructions immediately and do not attempt to bypass a security checkpoint or cordon for any reason. On the ground, clients need to maintain situational awareness at all times, keep up to date on the current and upcoming protest locations, roadblocks, and any further strikes that could prompt further service disruptions. Read WorldAware's alerts and study the attached maps closely, and liaise with Shannon and the rest of the Middle East North Africa team through WorldAware's Access to Analyst program for relevant updates. Communicate with your trusted local contacts, monitor all your internal message traffic, and conduct regular check calls with your organization's emergency response teams and crisis management teams if you have them in place. Develop a robust communications plan, have multiple forms of communication spanning multiple networks. Make sure your emergency comms plan includes mechanisms for face-to-face wellness checks if designated comms windows are missed or electronic devices are disabled or ineffective. Taking this a few steps further, we want to ensure all personnel in Lebanon have been briefed on all aspects of your respective organization's evacuation plans, whether it's a local in-country evac plan or a full country evacuation plan. Ensure your organization has identified and communicated clear thresholds for activating that evacuation plan, as well as specific action items for personnel during each phase of the plan. Validate and verify all routes to and from assembly areas and evacuation points. If you identify any potential choke points or your route passes through a known protest site, now would be a good time to survey a new route and map that into your plan. Additionally, identify primary, alternate, and contingency modes of travel to assembly areas and evac points. Ensure you have a plan and enough resources to transport everyone within your organization and their essential belongings. All that being said, if the situation in Lebanon deteriorates rapidly, options for evac are going to be limited. So, as I'm sure most of you are aware, protesters have already blocked key airport access roads, and as we already alluded to, overland travel into neighboring countries is not really a viable option. So now is a good time to inventory and build your inventory or build out your shelter in place kits, non-perishable food, water treatment, medication, cleaning, and hygiene supplies. Ideally, each assembly area and evacuation point should be stocked with a kit. I'm sure clients who've been on the ground for some time have already done so, but if you haven't, be prepared to resort to on-site power. Obviously, that not only means securing access to a generator, but also a steady supply of fuel. As with everything, we want to build contingencies into our resupply plan in case primary means are disrupted for whatever reason. A few closing remarks. Remember, the ongoing protests are just one stressor that could impact your operations in Lebanon. Criminal elements will exploit the protests and the overextended security forces and everything that comes with that. And as sectarian tensions mount, clashes could grow increasingly violent, escalating from isolated street brawls to running gunfights. So personal security 101 is important here. Keep your head on a swivel at all times. On the ground, travelers need to vary their daily routine so they don't establish a detectable pattern. Not only multiple routes to and from, but also different entrances and exits to buildings and varied departure and arrival times. Maintaining situational awareness means understanding what's normal in your immediate vicinity so you can quickly identify any deviations from that baseline. And as always, carry a small go bag with you at all times. Key identification, important contact information, travel documents, credit cards and cash, ideally enough to sustain you for at least 96 hours. Any required medications, extra communications devices and power supplies, high energy snacks, bottled water treatment, a flashlight with extra batteries, and some rain gear. And as always, track your location at all times, know where you are, where you need to go, and have multiple ways to get there. So study local maps, make mental notes of alternate routes, as well as possible safe havens, hotels, hospitals, in some cases the airport, along each route. We want to avoid lingering near security checkpoints and cordons, though, as well as near government buildings, as these could easily be targets of protest violence. If we're maintaining situational awareness and we understand the layout of the region, we can easily plan routes that circumvent common flashpoint areas or protest sites and other choke point areas. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you very much for your time. Stay safe.
Thank you, Shannon, Tony, and Fahim, and thank you everyone for listening in to our briefing. If you would like more information, you can visit us at www.worldaware.com.